Hello everyone, and welcome to our presentation on Pahoturi River complex predicates. Dineke and I would like to take a moment to thank the organizers of this conference, especially Laura, for making APLL happen this year, and we are very happy to take part. Some of you may know us, but just in case you don't, we are Dineke Schokkin and Kate Lindsey. At past APLLs, Dineke was affiliated with Australian National University, and I was affiliated with Stanford University, but we have since both taken new roles at the University of Canterbury and Boston University. Our work today is based on the fieldwork that Dineke did with the Idi community in Dimsisi village and the work that I did with the Ende community in Limol village. These two languages, Idi and Ende, are both Pahoturi River languages spoken in southern New Guinea. The linguistic question that we are addressing today concerns Pahoturi River complex predicates and their status as either auxiliary verb constructions or light verb constructions. We will present evidence to you today to show that Pahoturi River complex predicates do not fit neatly into either category. Today's talk is organized as follows. First, we'll give you a general overview of Pahoturi River as a language family. Then we'll talk about the complex predicates in Pahoturi River. Specifically, we will describe the non-inflected element of these complex predicates, as well as the inflected element. Then we'll go through a diagnostic test of light verbs versus auxiliary verbs and show how complex predicates in Pahoturi River line up with those diagnostics. Finally, we will conclude. Here is a map of the villages in southern Papua New Guinea where Pahoturi River languages are primarily spoken. You can see that 6 language varieties that have been identified as being within the Pahoturi River language family are identified on this map. From west to east, we have Idi and Tame. You can see the village Dimsisi, which is where Dineke did her fieldwork. East of Idi and Tame, you find Ende, Kawam, Em, and Agob. In the Ende circle, you'll see the village of Limol, which is where I did my fieldwork and gathered the data for this presentation. Before we get started looking at Pahoturi River complex predicates, let me first give you a general overview of the syntactic and morphological properties of Pahoturi River languages. First, Pahoturi River verbs have a complex inflectional morphological system. Verbs are inflected for both subjects and objects. There's also inflection for the tense, aspect, and mood system. Verbs are marked for verbal number, also known as pluractionality, and they are optionally marked for directionality. Within the tense, aspect, mood sphere, there are 4 tam values that are marked via morphological inflection and 1 that is marked periphrastically. The remote past, recent past, future, and irrealis are marked with a combination of prefixes and suffixes on the verb. However, the present progressive is marked using a complex predicate construction, which we'll be discussing today. Pahoturi River has different conjugational classes based on the actionality or the lexical aspect of the verbs. In contrast, the nominal morphology is much less complex. Pronouns have nominative accusative alignment, and in Idi, the nominal arguments have a neutral alignment for the core cases. Other semantic cases are marked on nouns by uses of suffixes and encletics. Today we are looking just at these periphrastic constructions for the verb. The periphrastic construction is a construction that involves 2 elements, one part that gives the meaning of the verb and another part that hosts the inflection. In the present progressive, the periphrastic construction is the only option. But in all the other tense aspect combinations, you find both periphrastic and morphologically inflected verbs. In these conditions, the periphrastic one is still very frequent. We analyze these periphrastic constructions both in the present progressive as well as in the other tense aspect mood combinations. We analyze them as complex predicates. Now, we define agree with the definition of complex predicates as being a construction that involves 2 or more predicational elements. These can include nouns, verbs, adjectives, and these 2 elements predicate as a single unit. That is, the arguments of these constructions map onto a monoclausal syntactic structure. As I said, Pahoturi River complex predicates always consist of two elements, which show the same division of labor. The first element occurs in a non-inflected form. This element provides the main lexical semantic information to the clause. The second element is always morphologically complex, but it is semantically empty. It serves as a vehicle for forming a grammatical clause. On this slide, you see an example from Ende. The example reads, Bogo obom ikop tegagan. Now, this phrase involves first bogo, meaning he, obom, meaning him. So this is an SOV type construction. And then you see two elements. Underneath the number 1, you see the word ikop, which gives the meaning of sea. And then you have tegagan, which is a morphologically complex element that has the prefixes and suffixes that indicate the remote past, as well as the fact that this is a third-person singular subject acting on a third-person singular patient. And the translation for this is, he saw him. Now let's take a closer look at the non-inflected element. In fact, there are two types of non-inflected elements. The first type is a class of non-inflecting words that only or typically occur in these types of complex predicates. You do not find them inflected with verbal inflection on their own. So some examples from Idi include yunjpa, which is see, drgwag, which is chase, and yandu, which is sleep. The other type of non-inflecting word elements are infinitive forms of a lexical main verb. Now, these elements you find both in a non-inflected form, so this infinitival form, but you also find them in inflected forms, so as the lexical main verb of a sentence. Some examples in Idi include blah blah, which is find, was, which is return, and papen, which is to tell. In this table, you see some more examples of the non-inflecting forms, the two types of non-inflecting forms. Type 1 is non-inflected in the infinitival form, the present tense, and the past tense. You can see this verbal element ikop, meaning to see. In the infinitival form, ngumomukoda ikope, you see that ikop is followed by the allative case clitic a, which gives this is always found with the infinitival form, ikope, to see. For the present tense, bogo obom ikoperan, ikop is followed by a second verbal element, eran, which gives has the inflectional marking for a third person acting on another third person actor in the present tense. And finally, you have the past tense, bogo obom ikop nagagan. Ikop is now followed by a different type of verbal element. Again, it's semantically empty, but it contains, or lexically semantically empty, but it contains the inflection that indicates this is, again, a third person acting on another third person, but this time in the recent past. If we look at type 2, we have a phonologically similar verb, kokop, which means to chop or to cut. And we have, again, the infinitival form. This verbal element, kokop, is followed by the allative case clitic a, momokoda kokope. In the present tense, the kokop is followed by the same verbal element, eran, which carries the inflection of a third person acting on a third person patient in the present tense, bogonai de kokoperan. And finally, in the past tense, we have bogonai de nokopan. He chopped the coconut. Now here, notice that kokop takes the inflectional elements, the prefixes and the suffixes that indicate that this is a third person acting on a third person patient, and that this is the recent past tense. So this is where, in the past tense, where you see the difference between the two types of verbs. Both of them have non-inflecting counterparts, so ikop and kokop, but these two verbal elements differ because the type 1 does not inflect in the past tense, but type 2 does.
So while, as Kate has shown, there are cases in which the non-inflected element is clearly verbal in origin or not typically encountered in nominal uses, there are various indications that this category of being the non-inflected element in a complex predicate is also available to forms that are more clearly based nominals. And I'll mention one of the pieces of evidence here. So there are some very frequent forms that occur as referential nouns, and then also as almost identical or completely identical non-inflected elements in complex predicates. And sometimes they even occur in a sequence. So in the first example here, we see the form yeka, which means speech or language, but also speak when it's used in a complex predicate. So, au idi yeka yeka wolan means yes, she speaks in idi language. And in the second example, we have the form what, which means garden food, but can also mean eat. Again, in a complex predicate when it refers to eating anything but meat. So wata jur began means I cooked the yams. So wata here refers to some yams. And then in the second one, begatania watirella, are you eating this coconut now? Means here what means to eat refers to the act of eating. Then as for the inflected element in complex predicates, there are a multitude of different forms attested. I'll just walk you very briefly through this table. So all forms in the table are bound roots, and we find three different base forms. One for the present progressive. So as Kate mentioned, this is the only way to express the present progressive in Pahoturi River is by a complex predicate. And then there are two different base forms for the non-present tam values. So one for the perfective and one for the imperfective non-present. And then each of these forms has one or more suppletive allomorphs as well. So there are two forms that are based on person suppletion, one for the present progressive and one for the non-present perfective. And then each of the three base forms also has a suppletive form for number, and specifically for number of the p argument. So when the p argument is plural, that means greater than 2, we find these different forms. So while person-based suppletion is not found elsewhere in the language, so these are all examples from IDI, suppletion for participant number is very common in IDI and also other Pahoturi languages, and is attested throughout the entire lexicon. So this is by no means a feature exclusive to these high-frequency forms. And then the other important thing to note is that these bound roots that occur in complex predicates and necessarily are inflected have the full range of inflectional possibilities available to them and will inflect pretty much in the same way as a lexical verb. From the literature, it appears that the following criteria are important to distinguish whether a complex predicate is best analyzed as a light verb construction or as an auxiliary verb construction. So remember our question at the beginning. We sort of want to do a test of the IDI and the constructions to see how well they hold up when they are held against each of these criteria. And so draw conclusions about the entire language family. So light verbs are typically seen as elements that combine with other forms that are not primarily verbal in origin, while auxiliary verbs are regarded as grammatically supporting another element that is also verbal in origin, but which takes a special form like an infinitival or participial form. And then auxiliary verbs can generally be regarded as being much more grammaticalized compared to light verbs. So light verbs are often identical in form to a corresponding main verb. Auxiliaries often have changed dramatically from their putative lexical verb sources. Also, light verbs typically occur across the entire verbal paradigm, whereas auxiliaries are generally restricted to certain tam values, for instance. And then also the fourth criterion is that light verbs are typically not defective in their inflectional paradigms either, whereas auxiliaries often show defective forms. That just means that they have fewer cells available in their inflectional paradigms compared to full lexical verbs in the language. And then finally, semantically, light verbs contribute at least some semantic meaning to the construction overall, in that they exhibit subtle semantic differences in their combinatorial possibilities. Certain light verbs typically go together with certain nonverbal forms, and that's not random. Auxiliaries, on the other hand, are often genuinely semantically empty and usually not restricted in the forms that they can combine with. So then, how do the inflecting forms in Pahoturi River languages behave with respect to these criteria? So as we have seen from the examples shown earlier in this presentation, the same inflected verb can occur with a non-inflected element that's clearly verbal in origin. So remember the Kokom examples from Ende that Kate showed. Or it can also occur with a non-inflected element that clearly is non-verbal in origin, like for instance Injapan or some of the other examples that we showed, like Ikop. And these Pahoturi River forms therefore clearly meet the criteria for both light verbs and auxiliary verbs when it comes to the type of thing that they can combine with. Then with regards to form identity, the inflecting forms in Pahoturi River complex predicates have clearly more in common with auxiliaries as opposed to light verbs. So these verbs under consideration do not occur as the sole main verb in a simplex predicate ever. They just don't occur like that. But they always occur in tandem with another element. So as such, they have no corresponding main verb to speak of. And while there are some leads as to the lexical sources from which the present-day auxiliaries could have grammaticalized, these contemporary forms look very different to their putative sources, and therefore a potential historical link is now very hard to establish. So the Pahoturi River inflecting forms show a correspondence to auxiliary verbs as well, in the sense that there are specialized forms for different tam values. So one root plus suppletive alternance is used for the present progressive, and then two different roots, again with suppletive allomorphs, are used for the non-present tenses. So one for imperfective and one for perfective aspect. But there is clearly the specialization across tam categories. However, when it comes to their inflectional patterns, so that is agreement with core arguments, directionality, and the like, ED-inflected forms and also other Pahoturi inflected forms are again more like light verbs, in that they show the full gamut of combinatorial possibilities, and there is no sign whatsoever of defective patterns. As mentioned before, ED exhibits many different conjugational subclasses of verbs, but the inflected forms in complex predicates do not behave differently from the other verbs in the conjugational class that they belong to. And then finally, inflected forms in Pahoturi River complex predicates are truly semantically empty and don't seem to be restricted in terms of the non-inflected elements that they can co-occur with. There is a clear division of labor in the complex predicate. So the non-inflected element contributes to meaning, and the inflected element provides a vehicle for categories that can only ever be formally expressed on a verb, like tam, directionality, cross-referencing of core arguments, and all those things. So in that sense, again, these forms are more like auxiliaries again. So in sum, it is very difficult to determine on the basis of criteria from the current literature on complex predicates whether the Pahoturi River constructions discussed in this presentation should be best analyzed as light verb constructions or as auxiliary verb constructions. They really display a mix of features, meeting some but not all criteria for either. So their highly grammaticalized and semantically bleached status, and the fact that they do not occur in simplex predicates at all, suggests that the inflected elements may best be analyzed as auxiliary verbs, as opposed to light verbs. In that case, it would make sense to broaden the definition of auxiliary verb to include cases where the lexical component of the complex predicate has a structurally ambivalent status as to its part of speech, and where the grammatical component behaves in a very similar way to full lexical verbs in terms of its inflectional potential. And I have to note that this was already anticipated by Gregory Anderson in his 2011 paper where he quotes data from the Papuan language MEC as providing a challenge for a principled distinction between light verbs and auxiliary verb constructions. So thank you very much for viewing our presentation, and we really hope that you've enjoyed it, and we're looking forward to your questions and comments during Q&A time. Thank you.